As an English literature student, I would know that language is the key to success in the subject. Obviously, all the reading, writing, and analyzing would require some basic understanding of language. But it's not enough to simply understand a text. One must deliver and articulate their ideas in a way that is compelling and persuasive in order for an argument to land. In fact, it's part of the Cambridge Mark scheme for how our essays are assessed. Under Assessment Objective 4, Communication, it states that the best answers are able to express complex literary ideas and arguments with clarity, fluency, and perception. This 11-word criteria would haunt me for as long as I study this subject, and has permanently shifted the way I express myself in writing and speech. Let me explain. I remember sitting in one of my English exams, staring at a passage I was supposed to analyze and feeling absolutely blank. No brilliant insight, no profound thesis, just sheer panic. Out of fear, I did what any desperate student might do. I faked it. I took the most surface-level observations and coded them in layers of flowery, elaborate prose. Suddenly, the metaphor critiques mankind's ignorance became, the metaphor functions as a scathing indictment to humanity's epistemic negligence, illuminating the pervasive myopia that characterizes our disengagement from deeper truths. Scary became macabre. I uttered these pretentious vocabulary like liminality, continuum, and dialectic with only a vague sense of what I was actually talking about. And somehow, by some miracle of God, when I got my results back, my scores were high. And that's when the imposter syndrome set in. I asked myself, did I actually have insightful ideas? Or had I just become really good at sounding like I did? Every time I felt unsure of my arguments, I reached for the same trick. Dress up weak ideas in sophisticated language. It became a crutch and obscured me from truly understanding the core of my argument. I started to spiral. Oh my God, am I stupid? What does that mean for the academia and theory that I so revered? If my intelligence could be feigned, what does that say about Lacan and his theory on unconscious subjectivity? I mean, what does that even mean? Ever since, I've never felt truly satisfied with myself walking out of an English exam without feeling a gnawing sense of guilt in my stomach. Because in the back of my mind, I understood there was power, maybe even a privilege, in the way I wielded words that would still earn me a relatively good score. I realized then, language is more than just a tool of expression. It's an instrument of influence. The way we frame our words dictates how our ideas are received, and thus the difference between a compelling argument and a forgettable one often lies not in the strength of the idea itself, but in how eloquently it is expressed. But is this a fair standard? At what point does eloquence exchange clarity for a tool of control? Today, I want to discuss the ethics of eloquence with you all, the social context behind our linguistic patterns, and honestly, just unpack this mental funk I'm going through right now. You may be asking, what is eloquence exactly? Well, according to the Oxford Dictionary, eloquence is defined as fluent or persuasive speaking or writing. Okay, still not exactly sure what this means specifically, but I want to draw your attention to the word persuasion. The immediate connotation of this word is an ability to influence others, to prove a person wrong, to convince someone of an idea that is more valuable and worthy than their own, but especially one that aligns with our own belief systems. Thus, we could argue there's an inherent power dynamic when eloquence is deployed, as it establishes a sense of intellectual superiority against the person being lectured, no longer simply serving as a means to deliver information. Eloquence, then, has the potential to be ethically dubious. While it can sway a person towards positive thinking and ideas, it also has the power to misdirect and manipulate down darker corners. But how is this power dynamic constructed, you may ask? Frankly, there are so many explanations as to why eloquence is such a powerful tool, but I think I boiled it down to two key reasons. The first is cognitive bias. There's a sort of unspoken human tendency to instinctively associate that complex language somehow equates to greater expertise, intelligence, and credibility, especially in fields unfamiliar to us. Our bias for complexity is interesting, as it's sort of counterintuitive to human nature. Many cognitive biases, like the confirmation bias or the availability bias, exist to reduce mental energy, helping us process information more efficiently. So why, in some cases, do we gravitate toward the more complex explanation? One of the most famous examples of this bias in action was from physicist Alan Sokal. In 1996, he published an article about quantum physics and postmodernism to the academic journal Social Text. This was the title of the article. Sounds sophisticated, right? The catch, it was complete and utter nonsense. Sokal deliberately filled his writing with this highbrow, complicated jargon, arguing that mathematical set theory was somehow equivalent to feminist politics, and made scientific assertions that any high school physics student could have debunked. Yet, when the article was published, it initially faced very little scrutiny and was actually taken quite seriously by the academic community. When Sokal revealed it was a hoax, he was obviously admonished, but his experiment had proven something unsettling. Eloquence can act as a shield, masking even nonsense to appear profound. The logical explanation would be that complex language requires a greater set of knowledge, experience, and study to understand, and therefore its use conveys a status of higher education, thus qualifying it as valid. Or perhaps because complexity mirrors the very nature of human existence. Life, the universe, our cells, and matter are inherently complicated, resisting simplicity. Perhaps when we encounter a complex explanation, we instinctively associate it with deeper thought and reflection because it renders itself more valuable to us as complex beings. To examine these two ideas, let's take a look at Hamlet's to be or not to be soliloquy, written by William Shakespeare. It is 31 lines of this labyrinthine, elaborate prose grappling with the concepts of life and death. And while I certainly agree with a lot of the points made by Shakespeare, would we still revere it if it were written in plain, blunt language? How could we debate or even reckon the truth of Hamlet's argument then? Frankly, there may not be a definite answer to an existential question like this. But why has this level of linguistic persuasion become synonymous with intellectual depth? Aristotle's classic rhetoric argued that persuasion relies on three key pillars: ethos, the speaker's credibility; pathos, an emotional appeal; and logos, logic, and reasoning. But I'd like to argue what underpins the rhetorical triangle is a nebulous, encircling ring we call eloquence. We trust the speaker's credibility because they sound sophisticated. We accept weak logic because it is dressed in complexity. And we're swayed emotionally by language that makes us feel inferior or uninformed. Eloquence creates the halo effect that subdues and sedates its audience into accepting messages less reluctantly. This subconsciously creates a mental pedestal for what forms of languages are deemed more authoritative and intelligent than others, at least somehow in my mind. I've created a diagram to illustrate this in what we'll call as Ni's hierarchy of linguistic prestige. At the very top is the peak of linguistic intelligence, including things like academic jargon, legalese, philosophical terminology. The second tier includes languages that are accessible but wield institutional power, such as corporate and political speak. At the very bottom is your everyday language, including slangs and colloquialisms that lack institutional power. Think the kids in the hallway who say skibbity toilet. Now, the structure of this diagram is not accidental. There's a reason why it mirrors the sociological structure of many societies. Where power resides at the top, certain language forms confer the same set of power, as these demographics are often afforded more opportunities for education and thus define which languages are considered educated and intelligent. The further down you go, the more marginalized the voice becomes. It ties into what French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu argued as linguistic capital, the idea that the way one speaks determines their social and economic position. Bourdieu argued that when one's language is decided to be legitimate by delegated institutions in society, it allows the speaker of that language greater access to jobs, services, and connections. To sum up this section, I want to share a quote by Bourdieu that I really enjoy, where he says, language is not only an instrument of communication or even knowledge, but also an instrument of power. A person speaks not only to be understood, but also to be believed, obeyed, respected, distinguished. I find value in this quote because it implies that eloquence is synonymous with the language of authority, and thus possesses the power to impose reception on others. As a result, when we privilege eloquence, we create barriers for people who rely on simplistic language or lack access to formal linguistic education. But with this in mind, I only have more questions in my head of who really defines what languages are considered legitimate. We've looked at it from a class perspective, but what about a colonial one? Linguistic imperialism is a concept coined by research professor Robert Phillipson, suggesting that the global dominance of the English language was constructed via the structural and cultural inequalities established in colonialism. When the British expanded their empires, they not only enforced a political change, but a linguistic imperative as well. It explains why ex-colonies such as Singapore or India prioritized English in educational and professional settings, as they were systematically suppressed to adopt English as the modus operandi. Speaking the colonizers' language wasn't just about communication. It became a prerequisite for social mobility and power. This Western-centric legacy persists as globalization allows for the West to socially and culturally penetrate every corner of the world. Although Mandarin speakers are the most populated, English still dominates as the global lingua franca, aka common language, that is considered status quo for global citizenship. Heck, even in Vietnam, English proficiency is often seen as a marker of intelligence and modernity. But you may be asking, Nhi, what does any of this have to do with eloquence? On a deeper level, linguistic imperialism isn't just about which language is spoken, but how it is spoken. In a meta-analysis on accent bias in the workplace, 4 scholars concluded that standard accented job candidates were perceived more hireable than non-standard accented candidates, while candidates who spoke in foreign accents had their accent bias particularly pronounced. The bias of eloquence is now complicated, as it isn't just about vocabulary or complexity, it's about whose voices are considered authoritative in the first place. Professors at the University of Chicago utter an incredibly impactful statement regarding the sentiment. They say, when a foreign accent acts as a signal, it is the prejudice, not the accent per se, that impacts the credibility of the speaker. Ultimately, it is our prejudiced, Western-centric culture that enables for these linguistic hierarchies to exist in the first place, and thus deepen the disparities of who is allowed to have a voice in society at all. Now, this final section is going to get a little weird, so please hang in there with me. You may have noticed that I've been referring to the word intelligence with these air bunnies across my talk. Language is complex, and the truth is, eloquence isn't always as persuasive as we think it is. Sometimes the very thing we associate with intelligence, verbosity, jargon, and complexity, actually signals the exact opposite. A study conducted by research professor Daniel Oppenheimer tested the efficacy of increasing the level of complexity in text in order to give a greater perception of intelligence for the writer. What resulted was a negative correlation between complexity and judged intelligence. Perhaps, sometimes, the more short, punchy, and blunt language actually carry the more persuasive impact. And this becomes increasingly vital in the social media age, or what I like to call the efficiency age, where every piece of information offered to us has to be done in a way that is instantaneous and efficient. Let's take a look at some examples, shall we? A bleak example would be how politicians like Donald Trump were able to curry public favor incisively because he rejected the eloquence associated with political elitism and embraced the blunt language of the masses. He's actually quite the figure for a sort of anti-eloquence. Or how social movements like Me Too, Stop Asian Hate, and Black Lives Matter were able to conjure up this massive support on social media thanks to the succinctness in their names, capturing virality instantly. Sometimes, languages that hold cultural value in the bottom tier, often surpass the need for institutional recognition as they dismantle the boundaries of social class. Thus, the hierarchy of linguistic prestige doesn't exist in these rigid rows, but are constantly changing in position, interacting with one another as society and language fluctuate. One of the reasons why Charlie XCX's album Brat captured the cultural zeitgeist was because of its lyrical brevity. Frankly, both Charlie and Shakespeare are tapping at the same subject matter, the same emotional beats, the same existential crisis. Yet when we reach an era where both of these works are looked at and appreciated on the same artistic plane. In my opinion, they already are, and maybe Charlie is a little bit better than Shakespeare, but only time will tell. Ultimately, I believe we should be valuing ideas over delivery. Regardless of anyone's linguistic skills or accent, we must have the patience and compassion to hear their voices and insight as all perspectives enrich our collective understanding of the world. This is in no way me trying to discredit academia or intellectualism. I am in awe of the expansive possibilities of language and how it has enabled us to capture the complexities of what it means to be human. But at the end of the day, language should be a bridge, not a barrier. And true intelligence lies in our ability to listen, understand, and embrace the unique ways in which knowledge is shared. Thank you.